Hello, I'm photographer Larry Ricker. I'm here at Minneopa State Park, just outside of Mankato, Minnesota. And as you can see, I'm at a beautiful waterfall here. It's called Minneopa Falls. This is the Upper Falls. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to tell you how to take waterfall pictures, and specifically getting the Silky effect with your waterfalls. Now, to get the Silky effect, you have to be able to get to a slow shutter speed. You need to have a shutter speed that's at least half a second or longer. The longer, usually the better, although it does depend on the waterfall a little bit. So you have to experiment. But in order to achieve that lower shutter speed, you have to be able to adjust the aperture so that your exposure still comes out right. So it's essential to have a camera, of course, and it doesn't have to be a real fancy camera, but you do have to have manual settings so that you can set the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture. If you can't set all of those, then just setting this shutter speed to a longer setting, what that's going to end up with is a overexposed picture, and probably all white. So you have to balance that with the aperture and with the ISO. Something else that's important from a camera point of view is that you have a camera that you can put filters on the lens. One thing, which brings me to the next important thing, and that's to have a polarizer filter, such as this one that I have. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a little while. Then the third main ingredient, if you're going to go for those longer exposures, you need to have a nice sturdy tripod so that your camera doesn't shake at all while you're taking the picture. Those are the three things: a camera that has manual settings, manual exposure settings, filter, a polarizer filter at least, and thirdly, a good tripod. One more item that comes in very handy is to have a remote. Now, if you don't have a remote, don't worry. It's not absolutely necessary. But what you should do is set your camera so that it's on a 2-second delay, at least a 2-second delay, so that when you press the shutter release, even though your camera is mounted on a tripod, you have a delay for any vibration to settle out before the actual picture is taken. Best thing though is to have a remote plus the 2-second delay. Okay, the final thing that comes in very handy, not necessary, but very handy, is to have a set of ND filters. And these are just plain non-graduated ND filters. I have a set of 3 here. The one gives me 2 stops of attenuation, the other one gives me 3, and then there's a 4-stop. So that just allows you to get darker and darker, or I should say longer and longer and longer exposures, because it's cutting down the light. The other thing that helps is to have a day like today, where it's mostly cloudy. Waterfalls are one of the things that benefits from having cloudy skies. You don't get any hot spots. You don't get any shadows on the waterfall, and everything around it is evenly lit, so you get a lot better exposure that way, a lot nicer pictures. Now today the sun is kind of going out in and out behind the clouds a little bit. It's mostly cloudy, but once in a while there'll be a break. That's okay as long as it's mostly cloudy. The unfortunate part is it's also drizzling off and on, but hasn't done that for a while, so hopefully we're okay there. So remember, the camera, polarizing filter, tripod are the essential things. Remote and the ND filters are another. So now that we know what the basic equipment is that you need, let's take a few pictures.
I had a whole video clip where I went through the basics of setting up the shot, how important it is to keep the tripod low, as close to the level of the subject as possible, setting the ISO as low as it can go, 100 in my case, aperture stop down, f22 here, and then spot metering off the brightest part of the waterfall. I guess my video guy forgot to press the video button. I'll have to have a word to him about that. In any case, this is the slowest shutter speed I could get with no filters. ISO 100, f22, 1/8 of a second. Not quite slow enough to get a nice silky effect.
So the next thing I'm going to do is add a polarizer. What the polarizer does is when you put it on, you can actually turn it around and you can see it making different effects. The reason we want a polarizer right now is because we want to get rid of a lot of the reflections coming off the water and kind of clean things up a little bit to make the waterfall really stand out. Now these filters have very fine screws, so you need to make sure that you don't thread them when you're putting them on. You have to be very careful about that. Okay, now the polarizer turns. Once you have it on there, the front of the polarizer actually turns. So you look through the viewfinder and you turn that, and in this case what you want to do is look for the setting that gives you the darkest water, because that's cutting down the most on the reflections. Now when you've done that, you probably have cut down the light by a stop or two. So again, before we were shooting at 1/8 of a second. So we're going to have to open that up by at least one stop, maybe two stops. One stop will get us down to, or get us up, depending on whether you're looking at how long it's open or how short it's open. But it gives you, if we go from 1/8 of a second, one stop would be 1/4 of a second. So set this for 1/4 and we'll see how that turns out. Now the thing with polarizers is they're not exact, so it may not be an exact 1 or 2 stops. You just have to kind of look at the results, look at your histogram. 1/4 of a second did not stop us down enough. We're still a little bit of exposed, so we've obviously got more than one stop of reduction from the polarizer. So I'm going to go ahead and try a 1/2 a second now, which is another stop. From 1/4 to 1/2 a second, that's another stop. Take another photo. That was a little bit too much. Okay, so I'm not quite getting 2 stops of attenuation from my polarizer. So from the 1/2 a second, I'll go back up to 1/3 of a second. A lot of this is trial and error, trying to get it perfectly exposed so that you have a baseline to go from. Okay, so the 1/3 of a second. Histogram looks good. Very few highlights being flagged, just a little bit. So that's our exposure now with a polarizer. Now you'll notice when we look at the photo here, we're getting a lot more of that silky effect that we're going for. So 1/3 of a second is giving us better than what the 1/2 did a little while ago, or 1/8 did a little while ago.
Here's the original photo, shot with no filter and at 1/8 of a second. And here's the second photo, shot with the polarizer at 1/3 of a second. You can see how the water down below the waterfall is darkened here, while the waterfall itself looks about the same as it did originally, only it's got a little bit more of the silky effect now.
Okay, unless you have ND filters now, you've gone about as far as you can go with a simple setup with a polarizer. Gives you some good results, but I'm going to show you some better ones. Again, I'm not changing the setup at all. Hopefully I can do this without changing the polarization or the anything else to do with the setup. Oop, wrong set. So I'm going to start out with the biggest, the neutrality filter that's going to give me the most bang for the buck, if you will. Again, this is a 4-stop, and I simply go and screw it on to the front here, trying to keep the polarizer pointing the same way, everything else the same. Okay, now I said it's a 4-stop filter. We're currently shooting at 1/3 of a second. So what I can do is on this camera, I have it set up that each click of the aperture or shutter speed knob is 1/3 of a stop. So like I said, I've got 4-stop filter on there now. So if I go 1, 2, 3, I get to 1.6 of a second. That's 1 stop. 1, 2, 3 gives me 1.3 seconds. That's 2 stops. 1, 2, 3. Another stop gives me 2.5 seconds. That's 3 stops. And then 1, 2, 3. I'm up to 5 seconds with a 4-stop filter. So you can see just how much difference that makes. With the polarizer and this 4-stop filter, I've gone from 1/8 of a second to 5 full seconds. We take our shot. Takes a little bit longer now. Check to make sure that we're still exposed just right, because it's not necessarily exactly 4 stops. But this is looking good at 4 stops. And as you can see, we're getting a lot more of that silky effect, losing all the granularity we had. You're also seeing now a few more streaks, not just in the waterfall itself, but in the water below the waterfall. You're seeing that starting to silk out too. And you're getting all kinds of interesting shapes and everything from that you didn't get with just the polarizer. Okay, I'm going to go one more step now. I'm going to introduce a 3-stop neutral density filter. Again, I've got to take the lens hood off here. Now by putting this 3-stop on, I got a 3-stop and a 4-stop, so that's 7 total stops of exposure reduction there. Yeah, 3-stop to 4-stop, that's 7 stops. Plus you add in the first 2, roughly 2 from the polarizer, and now we've got about 9 stops with these 3 filters. So now, with a 3-stop, I go from 5 seconds to 10 seconds. So that's 1 stop. Then I go to 20 seconds, that's 2 stops. Now, another stop would give me 40 seconds. Unfortunately, this camera, the longest it will go on its own is 30 seconds. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to go to 30 seconds. I have to open up the aperture by about a third of a stop. So I'm going from f22 to f20 on the aperture. Now unfortunately, just now we've got one of those bright spots that I was talking about before. So this is going to completely blow off our exposure. So I'll be back in a minute when there's a cloud again. Okay, we've lost the sun now. Back to original. Now how did I know how many clicks to go with my aperture? Well, to get from 10 seconds or from 20 seconds to 30 seconds on the shutter speed was 2 clicks. So 1 click on the aperture is going to get me to that total of 3 clicks. Okay. So now we're at 30 second exposure. Unfortunately, the sun's coming out again. That's the problem with this type of a day when you're taking long exposures, is the light can change actually while you're photographing. This would be a good time to make a couple of other notes though. I talked about the tripod before being low. Another advantage of it being low is that the lower it is, and the more, especially the more spread the legs are out, the more stable it's going to be. So that's another advantage to going low instead of setting up your tripod high. Now we do have some wind today. It's not too bad down in here, but on a really windy day, it can actually knock the camera around a little bit. So having your legs spread out a little bit, being lower down, is going to help stabilize. Another thing I want to say, I've got these round neutral density filters in the polarizer. The problem is when you stack them like this, you start getting some vignetting around the edges, and I'll show you that a little bit. So this is the lens I'm using right now is a 16 to 85 millimeter lens. I'm currently shooting somewhere around 30 millimeters. If I were to be shooting at 16, and I'll show you this in a little while, you'll start getting some dark fringing around the areas. That fringing is actually because you're shooting such a wide angle, you're actually taking a picture of the inside of the filters. So these screw-on types are less expensive. They do the job, but they do have some drawbacks. What's better is to, there's a couple of different systems out there. The most recognizable, or the ones that you'll find the most, are Koken and Lee, with Lee being the most, being the highest quality. But they actually have a holder that screws onto the front of your lens, and then they have square or rectangular filters that slide into those holders. So two advantages to that. First of all, you get rid of the vignetting problem that I just talked about. The second thing is, once you get up to about 9 stops of filter on here, it gets really tough to see through there, through the viewfinder, to see your composition and whether your polarizer is set correctly and that type of thing. With the Lee and the Koken filter systems, you can actually remove all but your polarizer. You can set up your shot and then you can just slide them back in. Having something like this, it's awfully difficult to unscrew, set up your shot, screw the filter back in. Just gets to be a mess. And like I said, these filters do have a tendency, very fine threads, so there's a tendency to strip them. And so the more that you're putting them on and off, just gives you more opportunity to screw up the filter itself. Or even worse, even the front of your lens. Okay, so I'm going back to my f/22 because we were a little bit overexposed just then. So that's shutting down the aperture just a little bit, and we'll see what happens here. Still shooting 30 seconds. Now again, I didn't have to reset anything up. I'm still shooting with the same composition I was shooting with before. Polarizers in the same position and everything else. But right now it is almost impossible to see through my viewfinder to see how things are looking. So now we have a good exposure on this. And as you can see, we now have a very, very silked out picture. It's not just the waterfall again that's silked out, it's also below the waterfall. And so yeah, looking very good.
In review, here are the images again, starting with the image with no filtration and 1/8 of a second exposure. Polarizer only, 1/3 of a second exposure. Polarizer and 4-stop neutral density, 5 seconds exposure. Polarizer, 4-stop ND, 3-stop ND, 30-second exposure.
One more shot I want to do here, and that's same setup and everything else, but I'm going to go to full wide, or my widest setting on my lens here, 16 millimeters. I'm going to shoot again and show you the result, and you'll see the vignetting around the edges. And there, I think you can, yeah, it's pretty plain there, especially in the top corners, the vignetting that's going on. So that's where, if you're just starting to get into this, you don't have the ND filters again, but you think you're going to be serious about doing this kind of photography, it's not only good for waterfalls, it's also good at lakes. You know, it calms the lakes down, gives you a flat surface. Consider investing in one of the holder systems like Lee or Koken. They're more expensive, but in the long run, they just do that much better of a job. I think that's all I wanted to discuss today. Hope you learned something from this video. And if you have any questions, make sure you put them in the comments below. Otherwise, you know the drill. Like, comment, subscribe. And thank you very much for watching.
Here are some other waterfalls I have photographed recently.